Chris is, a really articulate writer and blogger, and he's been somewhat of a proselytizer as well as an investor in the Bitcoin phenomenon. Why should we care about Bitcoin?
First, a lot of the attention initially, I think, was paid to the idea of Bitcoin as an alternate currency. That tends to be more kind of people with a certain political agenda, sort of anti-Federal Reserve, things like that. For people like me, like investors and sort of technologists and engineers, first of all, it's interesting just as a payment system. Number two is this idea that Bitcoin could be kind of a protocol for money on the internet and enable lots of new behaviors. So people have talked for decades about micropayments. We now have basically micropayments on smartphones with what are so-called in-app payments. Like as you're playing a game, you can pay $1 and get more goods on Supercell. That's turned out to be an incredibly successful business model. And so in theory, Bitcoin could enable similar kind of innovation in payments in areas outside of the smartphone. Number three, I would say, forgetting about Bitcoin as a currency, just the kind of the technology, the architecture, and you'll hear more and more about this, what people call the blockchain architecture, which is, we think of the internet as decentralized. In fact, a lot of the services are centralized. For example, DNS and certificate authorities for SSL. There's a whole bunch of sort of central points of failure, and there's all these efforts now using blockchain technology to make those fully distributed, which can solve a lot of problems. The last point I would make about Bitcoin is you can kind of think of Bitcoin as the largest software R&D company in the world. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of very, very smart engineers who are super excited about Bitcoin and working on Bitcoin-related projects. 40 years ago, that the great computer science innovations came out of places like Bell Labs. Now, if you look at the last 20 years, the internet, Linux, all sorts of open source stuff, it's all come from these kinds of distributed communities. And right now, those distributed communities are excited about Bitcoin, which our view is we want to invest in things that those communities are excited about.
Well, I'm wondering whether some of them are excited because of the technology possibilities, or whether because they're like hardcore libertarians. Do you find that as an obstacle in the eventual fulfillment of Bitcoin's promise?
I think it's definitely created a PR issue, and that in a lot of people's minds, Bitcoin's associated with these kinds of either extreme political views or illegal activities. All of the great computing movements actually had political components to them. This is the first one that is sort of a right-wing component. I think the past were all left-wing kind of movements. The computing movement came out a lot of the kind of 60s counterculture, Wikipedia, this kind of stuff was sort of this free information, everyone's a publisher kind of political movement. The open source came out of the sort of free software movement, which is very political, anti-intellectual property. So I would argue that you almost need these political movements to sustain these things. Like, how would you have sustained Bitcoin from 2009 until it became popular, 12, if you didn't have a whole bunch of kind of research? But imagine if AOL had won instead of the open internet, right? It seems obvious enough to us now the open internet is better and wins. It wasn't obvious in 1992. I mean, you had a multi-billion-dollar, well-funded company, ads on TV, they would show your AOL address, not your URL. It was very important that the internet won, and it enabled like PayPal, eBay, a whole bunch of these, YouTube. They were pretty aggressive early on. Like YouTube had a lot of copyrighted material. If the internet had been centralized, would YouTube have ever gotten off the ground? Would PayPal have ever gotten off the ground? I would argue that they're probably half of the services that people here use and love were at one time very controversial. And if you have a central gatekeeper deciding what is allowed and what isn't, you significantly decrease the amount of innovation. And so payments are one of the areas now that are still locked up. Go read forums about PayPal, and they decide what merchants are acceptable and what aren't. It's a significant, I would argue, constraint on innovation. And so, as somebody who I'd like to think of myself as pro-innovation, I think these kinds of open infrastructure platforms are very, very important.